Yes, it's time for the big question in which we tackle a major news story of the day. This week, the BBC have produced a podcast series about Shamima Begum, a British citizen who travelled to the Middle East to join ISIS. She has since expressed regret at this decision, and although she has not been linked with any terror attacks, many find it unconscionable that the Beeb should be doing a profile of this young woman. However, she was young and impressionable and would argue she is no longer a danger to society. So tonight's big question, should we forgive terrorists and those who get involved with them? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome Shamima Begum's lawyer, criminal defence solicitor Tasneem Akunji, and Charlotte Littlewood, who is a Henry Jackson Fellow and former counter-extremism coordinator. First of all, Tasneem, thank you very much for joining us in the studio. What's your view about the big question? Should we forgive terrorists or those that get involved with them?
Well, first of all, just to clarify, I'm Shamima Begum's family's lawyer, just to be clear. But in terms of forgiveness, we have a criminal justice system which levies accusations against people who are accused and then brings evidence to bear so that those people can be judged by a jury of their peers. Generally, those people, if they are found guilty, are then convicted and they serve a sentence, after which they're rehabilitated in society. That's generally the process that we as a civilized society use to punish those who've committed crimes. That entire system is being actively disengaged from Shamima Begum. So the idea is, as a society, do we forgive people? We generally do, depends on how heinous their crimes are, but we do it through a formal process under the rule of law. And our complaint here is that that's simply not being applied in this case.
Thank you for the correction that you are the family's lawyer. Do you think that the media have demonized this young woman?
Well, I think that anyone who's joined a terrorist organization has a certain amount of negativity coming their way. The question is the scope of that. Now, in terms of what's been the reporting on this overall, I think it's evolved. I think when she left at 15, the British public and the reporting around this was generally quite sympathetic. How do you bring a young schoolgirl back? But since we've had a different approach in government, particularly after Sajid Javid's decision, the reporting on this has changed a lot, and it may well be linked to unfortunate events, horrific events in the UK, like the Ariana Grande bombing, which was attributed to Islamic extremists, and individuals there were convicted of that. Now, a horror like that happening on UK soil will certainly change attitudes of the public, and it would no doubt change the approach that the press would take. But we don't believe in trial by media. We believe in trial by jury. And again, that's where we return back to.
We've just been talking, Charlotte Littlewood, about the Church of England and about Christianity. It's obviously a Christian principle to forgive. Is it time to do just that with terrorists and those that get involved with them?
To be honest, Mark, I think it's absolutely perverse that we are even thinking about whether or not we have any right in the forgiveness of Shamima Begum and anyone who showed any sympathy or support for ISIS. Those that have the right to answer the question as to whether or not she can be forgiven are absolutely tragically, in large numbers, no longer with us or displaced in hundreds of thousands. 3,000 Yazidis are still missing. Unspeakable human atrocity, cruelty, burning people alive, beheadings with kitchen knives. As we well know, Shamima Begum was aware as well of this kind of brutality before she left. Interestingly, the BBC's first episode really does give us that insight that she was aware of beheadings and she knew what she was going to join before she left. So forgiveness, I think we cannot be so arrogant to assume we have any right to even begin to talk about forgiveness here. That is for the victims and the victims alone. And whether or not she should be seen in the light of victimhood and grooming and given this platform is something that I think is wholly irresponsible of the BBC and playing into a victim narrative, which is a part of the problem, a part of the grievance, that the very nature of what can lead people to become radicalized.
Tasneem, this young woman knew about beheadings. Tasneem, sorry, I think there's an issue with the line. This young woman knew about the beheadings. How could we possibly forgive?
Well, we say young woman, but she was, of course, a child when she went, who was, by all accounts, groomed and trafficked. So, again, the issue of Shamima Begum is somewhat different to many others who've gone there as mature adults and made adult decisions. Now, of course, she was, quote unquote, married under an ISIS sort of ceremony within 2 weeks of her return, landing in Syria. And she was a 15-year-old girl who was married, quote unquote, to a 23-year-old Dutch national. Now, in anyone's books under the law of Holland or the UK, that would be considered statutory rape. And the reason for that is because under our laws, a 15-year-old cannot give consent to a sexual intercourse with an adult. Now, under that principle, the arguments being deployed against her are that she had somehow the culpability, despite being groomed, to have made a decision to go to Syria, but yet didn't have the wherewithal under the law to give consent to having sex with a 23-year-old. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that, well, she's not responsible and therefore Mr. Yago Rajic is a paedophile by definition, while simultaneously saying, but on another footing, she had absolutely the thinking required to make decisions to join a terrorist organization. And it's interesting that one says that, the victims of ISIS, and absolutely true, the victims of ISIS are the ones that can forgive ISIS. The question is, what did Shamima Begum do? What are her crimes? And certainly nothing has been attributed in terms of any sort of violence or anything to her. So,
Charlotte, what are this?
If the argument is that by joining an organisation you are responsible for the crimes of that organisation, well, then we'll have to ask the Kenyans whether they'll forgive Britain for beheading their people, British soldiers beheading Kenyans in the Mau Mau rebellion in the 60s. So, the same applies on both sides.
Charlotte Littlewood, let's go back to this BBC podcast. I must say, when it was announced, I thought it was an unedifying spectacle. And I do feel that there are parts of the media that have rather romanticised the image of Shamima Begum, glossing over, as you say, some of the awful material that she was, willingly exposed to, or at least, obviously, Tasneem mentioned that she was groomed and trafficked, but she was aware of these most egregious crimes that were being played out. However, don't we all want to understand where it came from, learn about her story, so other cases can be prevented?
I think the question is more, don't we want to learn and understand from the victims and learn and understand and hear from those families that have lost people and those that are still displaced? I mean, what I find very interesting were the comments about her being a child, but we saw an interview, and no one will forget, from her at 19 years old, saying that she was not regretting any of her decisions to join the Islamic State, that she is glad she joined because she met her husband. And if she had not joined, she would not have met her husband, and she would not have met a man like him, an ISIS fighter, a man like him anywhere else. Shamima Begum showed no remorse and continues to show no remorse for the ideology that she signed up for. She seemed to show regrets that the caliphate had fallen and that she was then in an uncomfortable position, didn't have access apparently to mint chocolate. But she very much said that she'd seen beheadings, she knew about the beheadings, she still came. She'd seen heads in bins and was unfazed. Manchester bombing, she said, was legitimate because it was a response to the attacks on Syria. Her opinions at 19 as an adult were abhorrent and clearly a threat to national security at the time. That's why she had a citizenship revoked. So I find it strange that we still talk about her considerations here at 15. We knew her considerations at 19.
Tasneem Akunji, no remorse.
Well, it's interesting because Charlotte is saying that, well, it's abhorrent that she's being platformed, but is quite happy to take snippets of parts of her story from the media and stitch them together to form her narrative. So I don't see why we should take snippets and not hear a much more fulsome account by her herself. But the snippets she has taken were taken from an interview given by Shamima Begum while she was in Al-Hol refugee camp, surrounded by ardent ISIS supporters. Now, had she said anything, even the little things that she said at the time that were slightly against ISIS, in that situation led to her life being put at risk, and the SDF then had to move her from that camp and move her to Al-Roj camp where she is now. So she was effectively under duress, under threat of death. Other women and children had been set alight in that camp, on their tents set alight, for saying anything against their previous sort of situation in ISIS. And since then, in her Al-Roj situation, where she's much safer, there are only 2,500 refugees there, and the SDF have much more control over that situation. Her interviews are very different in complexion to that which she said when she was at Al-Hol.
Okay.
So I think the ET documentary will allow for her to tell her own story and investigate elements of that may be truthful or otherwise. And I think that's what's important about this, that she gets to tell her story rather than others tell it for her.
Okay, Charlotte, I've only got a few seconds left. Just picking up on what Tasneem has said there, I consider what this girl at the time, young woman now signed up for, was truly reprehensible. You're so right to focus on the victims. But don't we want to understand how it happened so we can prevent the next Shamima Begum?
We do plenty of work to try and understand why people join terrorist organisations. We don't need a 10-part podcast to understand that. There are studies, there are books, there are experts, there are those that are working with those who are radicalised in prisons to de-radicalise them. There's a whole body of work, science and study. Do we need a 10-part documentary funded by us, the British viewers? Absolutely not.